Who do you serve? Well, for hopefully all of us, our first thought, obviously God. We look at, there are many things that we can serve in this world. Over the past 6 weeks, the fruits of what people serve has been more visible. You think of serving fear, serving money, serving people, serving idols. So we think of the scriptures. Who do you serve? We think of this attitude. Obviously, we want to serve God, but are there times in our life where we let down in that area? We let other things become more important. Where is our service? Who do we look to? There's an individual in the Bible that we're going to look at today. He has a book of the Bible named after him. But if you want to look more at his life, there's quite a bit that takes place before you get to this book of the Bible. We'll look at this section and we'll specifically begin in this book of the Bible, but then we'll lead up to what comes before. Some of the most quotable verses in the Bible come from this book, and one of my favorite verses. I've got 2 or 3 places where this quote is hanging up on our walls or in our house, and hopefully it becomes more than just quotes hanging on a wall, but is it something we really think about? Turn over to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24, the first book of the Bible that's named after an individual person. Here we see the book of Joshua. You get to the end of the book and you see an attitude, but what leads up to this? I want to begin with this quote, these verses, Joshua 24. I'd love to, this whole chapter 23 and 24, a lot in it. But we drop down here to verse 14, Joshua 24. It's again the Israelites still going after various things, serving other things, other gods, little g. Joshua 24, verse 14. Here Joshua toward the end of his life. Verse 14, now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river, and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. Verse 15, and if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Especially this end part of verse 15 is usually what's put on posters, put on various things, even on Bible cases. It's a great quote. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But you look at all through Joshua and where his life began, it was more than a quote. It was his way of life. He showed it. He lived it. We think of how did Joshua get to this point? We see this strong conviction at the end of his life. Again, not just a catchphrase. This was what Joshua lived by. What Joshua lived by. I say Joseph a few times. Feels like I said Joseph. Joshua. This afternoon we'll look at this individual and what we can learn. The title I've given this message is Joshua. Beginnings. Beginnings. We'll touch a little bit in the book of Joshua, but most of it will be before. What will lead up to it? So we'll look at some of that. Joshua, beginnings. Where he began. How he got to this point at the end of his life. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 25. On the way back to where we first see Joshua listed, that's usually where I begin of, wow, where was he at? But Deuteronomy gives a little bit of backstory before we get to this first mention of Joshua. We looked at this a year ago in May in the Bible study in Deuteronomy as we've been going through. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17 through 19, the section that mentions what took place briefly. We don't see a lot of the details that we'll see earlier here in Exodus. But Deuteronomy 25, verse 17, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt. This reminder of what they did, to remember it. This word for remember is the same word that we see for remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. The nation of Israel was to remember what Amalek did. As we think of the Amalekites, what took place? What did they do? This reminder as they are coming out of Egypt. Verse 18, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. This reminder that was given here, again, something to remember. Remember what they did. Why was it so important? Amalek was the son of Esau's son, Eliphaz, and his concubine, Timnah. So here we see the grandson of Esau's wife, Adah. See, some of that background that we see here, again, was family. And they attacked the stragglers at the back. They didn't come forward straight away. They did it sneakily, kind of like guerrilla warfare, some commentaries talk about. But we see them attacking family. Kind of sad. We won't go there. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Through much of the beginning part, verses 1 through 8, we see they were to utterly destroy, as we see here in Deuteronomy as well. Saul didn't follow through on God's command. See, Samuel had to finish it. We think of this reminder of what Amalek did, to remember it. Why this is important, because if you turn back to Exodus chapter 17, this is where we first see Joshua mentioned by name. Exodus chapter 17, Joshua chapter 17, Exodus 17, already starting off well. Exodus chapter 17, we finished with the Red Sea on the last great day in Exodus 14, and at 15 we looked briefly at there's three murmurings that take place after the Red Sea leading up to this point. We see the first one back in chapter 15 as they murmured there's no water. We see into chapter 16, verse 2, the second time they murmur because there's no meat. There's no bread, as we'll see that manna being given to them. We see into chapter 17, again, third time that this is mentioned, verse 2, this murmuring or contending with Moses, again, with no water. And so the water comes out of the rock, God's deliverance. And through this section then leads into chapter, still here in chapter 17 of Exodus, verse 8, Exodus 17 and verse 8. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, and Moses said to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joseph did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. We see this first mention here in verse 9 and 10 of Joshua. I was a little surprised. I always love digging into different individuals in the Bible, and I thought, well, surely it would have been earlier coming out of Egypt. But here's the first place that Joshua is mentioned. This Hebrew word for Joshua here, Strong's number 3091. And this word for Joshua means the Lord delivers, or Jehovah saves or delivers. Here we see the Lord delivers. It's an interesting statement here as we see this full story as it continues to go through. Moses giving very specific instructions. And already in verses 9 and 10, what do we see of Joshua? He listens. He follows directions. We think of he obeys. He doesn't, I don't think this is the best course of action. Some commentaries, I wonder how far off they get. They say, here Joshua is a great military might. It doesn't say that. Now, he might have been. Maybe he had abilities in this area. We don't see that specifically mentioned here. We see Moses telling Joshua, choose some men, go out and do this. But we see, was it because Joshua and his fighting ability was able to save Israel? No. Kind of a different kind of a miracle that takes place here. Verse 11, and so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. I kind of wonder, how long did it take for them to realize it? If God told them directly, and he's like, my hands are tired, and all of a sudden they started losing, and get your hands up. It's an easy thing to think of, but this was not just a 5-minute battle here. You think about keeping your hands up. How long, and how after a while your hands are up and they just get heavy, they're tired. We think of this kind of humorous in some regards. Verse 12, but Moses' hands became heavy. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So you think of most of the day spent in this battle. And you picture kind of a little bit of humorous, 2 guys holding up Moses' arms, and they're still tired, and he's like, you picture the holding up, but God's command that's here and this miracle that takes place. But what was to be learned through this? We think of through this whole section, verse 13. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And it goes back to Deuteronomy. Here they're coming after the stragglers at the back. What that full story is mentioned there. And here we see Joshua, given this reminder, he defeated. Well, he had to do his part. He had to listen, do exactly what God commanded, what Moses had told him to do. Defeats Amalek. We see in verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book, and recount it in the hearing of Joshua. It's interesting that Joshua was to hear this. Why? Maybe see this through his leadership later on. We see what this was required. Was this to stand out to Joshua to realize, all right, do you think Joshua really thought, this battle was mine. Look at how good I am. Or did he realize, wow, this was the mercy of God. God helped us every step of the way. What was Joshua's thinking? We'll see that through this whole section. But here, this memorial, this remembrance, in the Hebrew, this word means remembrance or record or reminder. To remind, first of all, the people and Joshua. Had God already started to work with Joshua to see that this might be the next person after Moses? Seems maybe to point to it a little bit. So we think of this memorial and recount it in the hearing of Joshua. And I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. This recounting that's mentioned in the hearing of Joshua. Other words used for this is rehearse. This Hebrew word 7760 means to convey, to recount it in the hearing of Joshua. Remind Joshua of this. Again, you think this stood out in Joshua's memory? Where he would think, wow, it wasn't, wow, look at all the time I put into being a warrior. Yeah, I think he realized this was not me. In this reminder of who was there every step of the way. Keep coming back to these same phrases we've been looking at in the last day of unleavened bread and the following Sabbaths. It wasn't Joshua's might. This reminder was there. It wasn't Joshua's might. He still had to do his part, had to do what was asked of him. But this remembrance that was to be there, as we see as it continues, Verse 15, and Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. That time when they would be completely wiped out. This reminder here of what Joshua, the first time we see him, it's an interesting story. And it continues. If you continue into Exodus chapter 24, you then get into the 10 Commandments given on Mount Sinai. Exodus 24. Got Joshua in the mind. Exodus chapter 24. We'll begin here in verse 12. As Moses is preparing to go up onto the mount. Exodus chapter 24, verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone, and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them." Think of this going beyond just the 10 Commandments, these reminders of building on them and showing the principles behind the 10 Commandments. And I will teach you them, verse 13. So Moses arose with his assistant, Joshua. And Moses went up to the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, "Wait here for us." Doesn't say wait here for me. Wait here for us. Joshua is with him. Wait here for us until we come back to you. Until we come back. Not one or the other, till we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If anyone has difficulty, let him go to them. Then Moses went up into the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. Think of Joshua going with him. Verse 16, now the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days, and on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the cloud, out of the midst of the cloud. God calls to Moses. Joshua is still there, but doesn't come before God, as we see here. But he's still up there with him. Some commentaries say, well, he only went up halfway up the mountain. I don't see any reference to him saying he only went halfway up. Now, again, it doesn't show that he went the whole way. We'll see other places where Moses comes down with a huge super sunburn from seeing just the backside of God. Who has become the Word, as we see in that section. We think of this reminder here. Joshua wasn't right there beside him the whole way, but he was up with him, serving, as we think of this statement that's used of him, his assistant. It's Hebrew word for his assistant, Strong's number 8334. You have the King James, it says minister. This word simply means to serve. Moses is a servant, someone there to help. What do you need? Can I get something? He was there to assist Moses, to serve him, to be there. Here we think of Joshua and what's mentioned here. Think of specifically, he served. He served. Here we see Moses, and we see later it goes beyond just Moses. He served God, but this reminder here that he served. He was there going up. Now, again, those instructions weren't with Joshua there as well, but Moses was up there. Joshua was, at least at some point, whether there was a partial going up, but Joshua went with Moses. We see as it continues through the next section in chapter 32. The next time we see Joshua mentioned, Moses is up on the mount for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days and 40 nights. Moses on Mount Sinai, Joshua at least somewhere up there with him, not maybe beside him, but we see going up, serving, being there for him, assisting him. Chapter 32, we see the golden calf incident. Verse 7, and the Lord said to Moses, "Go get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves." We think of this corruption that took place with the golden calf. Verse 9, and the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people indeed as a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make you a great nation. Moses, as we see in the next verses, intercedes, asks for God to reconsider, asks for this, again, to continue to work with these people, and Moses then would come down. We see dropping down to verse 14, God listened, so the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. You think about the prayer of one man changed God's mind. Maybe it was a test to see, well, how quickly would he say, yeah, get rid of these people, let's just me be the one. Maybe it was partly a test. We see God relenting in this harm, but this intercession of Moses, fervent prayer of a one individual avails much. Think of this reminder here. Verse 15, and Moses turned and went down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. The tablets were written on both sides, on the one side and on the other they were written. Now the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. So we see Moses coming down, and Joshua isn't right there right away, so whether he was partway down, we see as he does get to Joshua, verse 17, and when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. Joshua was not going up and down the mountain. He didn't know what was going on down there. Has this concern with Moses, verse 18, and he said, it is not the voice of those who shout in victory, nor is it the voice of those who cry out in defeat, but the voice of those who sing that I hear. Joshua was still not quite sure. Moses tells them what it was, and they eventually do see as they come all the way down. Moses, very upset. You think of what took place. And we sing to verse 19, so it was as soon as he came near the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing. So Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Think of all that Israel had done. Again, Joshua being right there beside Moses coming down, assisting him, concerned. Joshua heard, and heard later what took place. But again, Joshua being there, assisting, as it says, the assistant to Moses. Turn to Exodus chapter 33. It's this command to leave Mount Sinai. Moses goes back up. We see 40 more days. The first 40 days listed as without food and drink. Here in Exodus 33, verse 7, as they're commanded to leave, Moses meets again. Exodus 33, verse 7, Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting. And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp. And so it was, whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle, that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he had gone into the tabernacle. And it came to pass when Moses entered the tabernacle that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord talked with Moses. All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshipped, each man in his tent door. Again, we see here from a distance. We then see verse 11, Joshua again mentioned. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, and he would return to the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. Start to look at more of Joshua. Here's the first place we see his father's name mentioned. Sometimes it's a joke of, he didn't have a father or mother. He was the son of Nun, N-U-N-O-N-E. We think of this first time his father's mentioned here, the son of Nun, or other translations of Non, N-O-N. This is again listed as the father of Joshua. Not much is mentioned about his father here, but we think of, as you start looking at him, he's mentioned as a young man, Joshua. This word for young man in the Hebrew meant a young man, a servant, a young male servant. We'll see some of this mentioned where we can put an approximation at his age. It doesn't tell us specifically, but very likely could have been in his 20s, as we'll see a little bit of this in Numbers. But you look at Joshua, he didn't go to his tent. He stayed by the tabernacle as Moses went in. So we see earlier that Joshua served, but here we see another level. He diligently served. Some commentaries, well, maybe he was kind of a guard, making sure no one could come in. The point was he was still assisting Moses. He said, Moses in the tabernacle. Oh, good, now I have my vacation time. I'll go off on my own. He still diligently served. Maybe Moses is going to come out and he needs something. What do I need to go get for him? What needs to be done? He diligently served. We continue to see more and more fruits of Joshua. The next time we see Joshua mentioned by name, turn over to Numbers chapter 11. We're getting to one of the more famous maybe stories when you think of Joshua, where I thought about starting in one of these sections and leading to it because it tells us his name before it's changed to Joshua. Numbers chapter 11. But again, we see what he's referred to here. Numbers chapter 11 and verse 28. So Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, one of his choice men. So we see here Moses had more than one assistant. Here we see Joshua being mentioned again as Moses' assistant, one of his choice men. You think about someone you can depend upon. You think about someone who, he was right outside the tabernacle. I didn't even ask him to be there, but he stayed there. And if I needed something, he was right there for me. He was dependable. I could trust him. If he needed something, he was following God. He was directing. You think about this again, service. It comes back to, again, he diligently served. Again, mentioned here as Moses' assistant, the same word that was used in Exodus. Again, a minister, a servant, to serve. Again, one of his choice men. So there were others, but here was someone who was diligently serving, being there, helping. And as we'll see, it kind of goes into the next section, chapter 13. As you think about diligently serving, he was dependable. You think about people you can depend upon. So-and-so, they always uplift and encourage, and they're always there to help those that are dependable. Well, certain people, only if I call them, then they'll help me out. But you think here was someone dependable. Numbers chapter 13, with a little bit more of his backstory mentioned here. Numbers 13. Here the spies are chosen. As we think of this section, Numbers chapter 13 and verse 8, we see from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea, the son of Nun. So we start to realize, all right, well, this is not another one of Nun or Non's sons. Here we see this Hoshea, who would become Joshua, what his name originally was. Hoshea, this word for Hoshea, or Oshay, other translations have, it means deliverance, salvation. It's interesting, it will change from this, and we'll see, as we already looked at, and the first time we see Joshua's name, it's listed as Joshua. We'll see this again change. We see dropping down to verse 16. These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua. Again, why? Because God called him Joshua back in Exodus when they came out, when they fought against Amalek. The name Joshua, as it's changed, again, Hoshea, what his name was, meant deliverance or salvation, but there's a difference in Joshua's name. Joshua means the Lord delivers. So what goes from deliverance, how does it work to deliver yourself? Well, not the intent. God changes his name, calls him Joshua. Moses as well calls him Joshua. The Lord delivers. Wonder if his name would keep going back to that time in Amalek, coming out and fighting and realize, all right, God delivers. It's God who's delivering, not me. This recurring theme. As we think of this section, Caleb being listed among these individuals, in verse 6, the tribe of Judah, Caleb the son of Jephthah, and we see again Joshua in verse 8. Joshua was with the tribe of Ephraim. So you start to think, out of all these people, as we went through coming out of Egypt, you're looking at close to 2 to 3 million people. You think of how many people are in your tribe, and you were selected as the representative for your tribe. Quite a reputation. Quite an example. So we think of both Caleb and Joshua. But unfortunately, there's 10 others who didn't stand the test. Only 2 people spoke up through this whole example. Caleb, as you look at, well, how old was he? We have record of how old Caleb was. You can hold your place here, Joshua chapter 14. I couldn't find any specific place that mentioned Joshua's age. If you see it, let me know. Maybe I looked over it. Joshua chapter, is in my notes here. So we think here, Joshua chapter 14, verse 7. Ooh, it was there somewhere. I love how you put the pieces of the Bible together. You get the whole story. So how old was Caleb? Caleb tells us, Joshua chapter 14 and verse 7, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. Caleb showing us he was 40 years old. And so we think of Joshua definitely wasn't older than 40. We think of very likely could have been in his 20s, somewhere between 20 to 40. Maybe he was in his 30s. It doesn't specifically say. We see this reference again in Exodus to being called a young man. So maybe why he could have been in his 20s or 30s. Caleb is also one of the ones who speaks up first. So maybe one of the older of these individuals selected. But you think of Moses being in the wilderness after he was rejected to bring Israel out, and he's in the wilderness for 40 years. So sometime after Moses leaves, here Caleb is born very quickly after that point, and Joshua sometime later. Wonder if his father, again the son of Nun, mentions his mother, whether they talked about it. Moses is off and he was rejected, and this reminder of God would bring us out. We think of this reference through this, and we won't go through this whole story in chapter 13 and 14 of Numbers, but we think of, again, Caleb being 40. We think of the reference to 20. I think all of them had to have been over 20 because those 20 and over were rejected who didn't look to God in this example. We see here in chapter 14, after they speak up originally, they basically sleep on it. They think about it through the night. The majority of the people are murmuring. Verse 6, Numbers 14 and verse 6, and Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephthah, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. See verses 1 through 5, they're saying, let's get another leader and let's go back to Egypt. You think about being upset. How could you possibly think that? Verse 7, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. I love that phrase. They're our bread and butter. They're nothing. They're our bread. They're to be as food for our consumption. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And every time I read that, you hope, oh, you're right, I forgot. But it doesn't go that way. Verse 10, and all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Joshua and Caleb were close to being stoned to death because they stood up for God and didn't have fear in the things around them. God steps in. Again, verse 10, and all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. God steps in and intercedes for Joshua and Caleb, and quite a few statements are made about them through this section. We'll see dropping down to verse 29, Numbers 14 and verse 29, the carcasses of you who have murmured against me shall fall in this wilderness, all of you who were numbered, according to your entire number, from 20 years old and above. Why, those spies very likely had to have been over 20. We know Caleb was 40, so somewhere in that age, because they were accountable to realize you should have known better. And so whether Joshua was in his early 20s, we don't know. But we know he was at least 20 or older, and very likely wasn't over than 40 years old. And so those that murmured and rejected God, 20 years old and above, would die in the wilderness through that wandering for 40 years. We think of those exceptions mentioned, verse 30, except for Caleb, the son of Jephthah, and Joshua, the son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. You see as well as it goes through more of this story, dropping down to verse 38. How many times? There's quite a few verses that tell us who the exceptions were. Verse 38, but Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephthah remained alive of the men who went to spy out the land. We think through this, so many examples that we see of Joshua and Caleb both mentioned here. We'll see others that are mentioned about them here. But again, one of those principles, Joshua stands up for God. He's not standing up here as the assistant of Moses. He still was assisting Moses. But here he stands up as a viable witness to say, I went into this land, God can deliver us. He stands up for God. I think he did it all along, but now we see a serving of God specifically shown here. He served God. He didn't, Moses, what do you think? Should I stand up here? He stood up for God. Quite an example. The next time we see Joshua mentioned, Numbers chapter 26. See a few of these. We kind of hit just a few of the verses, but I love just seeing this reference here, chapter 26. We see the second census of Israel here. In the midst of this, verse 65, Numbers 26, verse 65, or at the end of this. For the Lord had said to them, they shall surely die in the wilderness, so there was not a man left of them except Caleb the son of Jephthah and Joshua the son of Nun. He's going back to those that would live to go into the promised land as God had promised. The only two individuals who stood up of those 12 spies stood up for God, to serve God. The next time we see Joshua is just into the next chapter, and now he's appointed to take over after Moses' death. It's one of those examples that I love to read. Here we see into chapter 27, is God appoints the next leader. Think of leader, again, in quotes so many times, oh, the leader, he's the one leading. No, God led. It was the next servant that pointed to God. Numbers chapter 27, verse 12. And I love how this takes place. You look at the humility of Moses. He doesn't, oh, I know who should take over after me. I know who it is. He keeps pointing back to God. Numbers chapter 27, verse 12. Now the Lord said to Moses, go up into this Mount Abiram and see the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people. This reference, he would die, join his ancestors in the grave, as Aaron, your brother, was gathered. Aaron dies earlier in chapter 20, verses 22 through 29. We think of this mention in verse 14. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you, talking about Moses, rebelled against my command to hallow me, to set God apart as holy, at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah on Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation. Quite a statement. You look at through time. Somebody, well, my son should be the next one in charge. I have the person who should be there. He says, let God do it. Can you think of seeking again God's will, asking for what he wants, knowing he knows perfectly well who should be there? We say, set a man over the congregation, verse 17, who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep who have no shepherd. And he wants there to be a servant, a leader to help, to point towards God continually. Verse 18, and the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Joshua mentioned here of having God's Holy Spirit. Think of this attitude and whom God's Spirit is there. Verse 19, after these hands are laid on him, led by Moses, set him before Eleazar the priest. Again, Aaron died. Here was Eleazar who replaced him. Set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and inaugurate him in their sight. This selection of Joshua was to be public, for them to see. Here's who God selected. It was not who Moses selected. It was who God selected. It was to be before Eleazar the priest, and he was mentioned here in verse we'll see it here in other places as well, but verse 19, he inaugurated him. This word inaugurated, other translations have commissioned him in their sight. The Hebrew word, it means gave him charge, commissioned him. Here's what your responsibility will be. So we think of this attitude that was there. We see as it continues, verse 20, and you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. So he had some authority. Moses wasn't dead yet. He was still continuing to lead, but it would eventually fully pass over to Joshua. Verse 21, he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, and you shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the children of Israel, with him all the congregation. Again, this official selecting of Joshua, exactly how God gave command. Verse 22, so Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And he laid his hands on him and inaugurated him. Still the same word that was used in verse 19. He commissioned him, other translations have, just as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses. Again, that leadership passing down. We think of this attitude that was here, commissioned him, given the responsibilities. He saw as assistant to Moses all those years of what Moses did. Moses made mistakes, but overall, Moses kept pointing to God. Joshua was to take over and serve, still pointing to God. Why it keeps coming back to his name, the Lord delivers. Where this emphasis for Joshua and how important it was. We see dropping chapter 32. I love chapter 27 and how this God appoints the next leader. Number chapter 32, verse 12. The next place we see, again mentioning both Caleb and Joshua again. Numbers 32, verse 12. Again, verse 11 sets up the full sentence. Surely none of the men who came up from Egypt, from 20 years old and above, shall see the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh, and the Kenizzite, and Joshua the son of Nun, for they have wholly followed the Lord. We've gone through a whole sermon on Caleb before, and you think of this statement. For both Caleb and Joshua, they fully followed God. What a statement. Can that be made of us? Can God say that about us? Yeah, we make mistakes, but we fully follow God. Well, I keep most of the Sabbath holy. There's times I just get tired towards the end of the day. I'm going to put a movie on. I'm going to play video games. Do we fully follow God? Do we look to him in all areas? Joshua, again, listed here with Caleb as two individuals who fully followed God. Quite a statement that's made about them. We see Joshua again mentioned here in verse 28, again of being the next in position. So Moses gave command concerning them to Eleazar the priest, to Joshua the son of Nun, and the chief fathers of the tribes of the children of Israel. We see, dropping to chapter 34, at least give you these references before we get to the next ones in Deuteronomy. Numbers 34, verse 17. These are the names of the men who shall divide the land among you as an inheritance: Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun. Moses continuing to point to who would replace him, Joshua, as that servant. Then brings us into Deuteronomy, where chapter 1. So we've been going through Deuteronomy. Seems like ages ago when we started it, but it's good refreshers. You think of, all right, Deuteronomy. Here you're getting on the precipice of going into the promised land. You've had the last of those spies and those people that were 20 and older who died in those 40 years in the wilderness. And here you have their children coming along, older now, coming in, getting ready to cross over. And these reminders, don't forget what you saw. So many of them saw them as kids. You think of those coming out. Joshua, as a young man, saw the Red Sea. They saw all these things take place. And here only Joshua and Caleb and their families are mentioned of coming into the promised land of all those who had died through the wilderness. Think of, what was it like? Here in the Deuteronomy, we see a different aspect of Joshua, because now it's a matter of days, maybe a month or two before they're getting ready to cross into the Jordan. And all these things of reviewing God's laws, instructing them, don't forget about God. And here Joshua knows it's just a matter of days or months before Moses dies and he takes that mantle to serve. What was going through Joshua's mind? Here we see this word that will start to come up more and more. It's interesting because Joshua was not, oh, well, of course I should be the person next. Obviously, I'm awesome. I'm fabulous. You still see humility from Joshua. Quite an attitude. something that oftentimes is lacking, even in us as God's people. Well, of course God should have chosen me. Why? Here Joshua still has an attitude of humility. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 38. The review again of the penalty of Israel's rebellion. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 38, we see breaking into this. Verse 37, the Lord was also angry with me for your sake, saying, even you shall not go in there, talking of Moses. Verse 38, but Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall go in there. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. You think there wasn't some uneasiness with Joshua? Well, obviously Moses, he's the one God's been working with. I've just been serving Moses. This encouragement. We'll see this over and over, this word encourage. This word encourage here, Strong's number 2388, maybe something we need at times. This encouragement during these last 6 weeks. All right, God is there. God is with us every step of the way. Think of this encouragement, this word here. It means literally to strengthen, to give Joshua strength, to encourage him. It wasn't to build him up. Oh, Joshua, you're clearly awesome. You're the best in the world. It wasn't to give him false encouragement. It was, don't forget who's with you. Don't forget your name, what it means. The Lord delivers. God chose you. He will be with you. This encouragement of God's with you. That's the encouragement you want. That's right. It isn't about me, because when you start to think, it's me and my might, yeah, I'm going to falter. It's God's might. It's looking to him. Probably that encouragement is so much through Deuteronomy as we've been going through, and it's a great review again to think of all the miracles God did for Israel. We think of this reminder to encourage Joshua, to encourage him not to be discouraged and think that he was doing it all on his own. But God was with him every step of the way, just as he is with us every step of the way, if we continue to follow him. Turn to chapter 3 of Deuteronomy. Just a handful of times Joshua is mentioned in this book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 3. Lots of times that it will reference back to Exodus, where it mentions examples. Deuteronomy 3, verse 21. Think of kings that came against Israel, this protection. We see in verse 21, and I commanded, Deuteronomy 3:21, and I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these 2 kings. So will the Lord do to all the kingdoms through which you pass. You must not fear them, for the Lord your God himself fights for you. You think this didn't strike into Joshua of, just like when I was there with Amalek, just when we were going against, it was God's might every step of the way. This reminder is he would be crossing over to do what God asked him, to divide the nations, to drive out the nations, and to put those tribes where they were to be in that promised land. And God saying, it's not about your might, Joshua. It's about mine. I will be with you. Don't fear the kings. Fear God. We see dropping down to verse 28. But I commanded Joshua, in this reminder that Moses was not allowed to go in. It says, but command or charge, other translations have, command or charge Joshua, and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over before this people, and he shall cause them to inherit the land which you will see. Quite a few, again, action words here. Command Joshua. It's the same word that we saw back in Numbers 27, verse 23. and I think 19 as well for inaugurate. It's the same Hebrew word, to command him, to again give him charge, to commission. Here's what your responsibility is. You wonder how much. It doesn't talk a whole lot about what Moses specifically said, but you wonder, what were the things that Moses told him? You were right there at the Red Sea with me, Joshua. It wasn't me who divided the water. I lifted up this stick that God gave me, and God divided it. He dried out the land. We walked through it. I led, I served, but it was God. He kept pointing to God. This reminder to command Joshua, and this same word we saw earlier in chapter 1 of encourage him. The same encouragement. Again, it wasn't by his strength, and this encouragement, how important this encouragement is. Do we try to tear people down and, I'm better than you, and hear this encouragement of, don't forget, God's the one who will bring you through. This encouragement that every single one of us has from God. And this third principle that's listed here in verse 28, and strengthen him. It's another word that's added, and we'll see it later as well. Strong's number 553. Strengthen him. This word means to be strong, determined, bold, courageous. Because it keeps coming back to, it's not by your might, Joshua. It's by God's might. God told you, here's what has to be done, so you can have courage that he's not going to lie. He's going to follow through. You have to just keep following God. Do exactly what he says. We see in the chapter then 31, is the next time we see Joshua mentioned here in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 31, begin in verse 1. As Joshua is mentioned here, Deuteronomy 31 and verse 1, Then Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. Also the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. Here Moses is 120 years old. Verse 3, the Lord your God himself crosses over before you. He will destroy these nations from before you, and you shall dispossess them. Moses starts where it should always be. God's the one who's going to bring you through this. We think of what we've been going through to some limited degree in the past 6 weeks. God is the one who will bring us through this. He's where we always have to look. And here Moses then points to Joshua, but God was first. Joshua himself crosses over before you, just as the Lord has said. You can trust Joshua because he's going to be pointing to God. And if God says, here's how you cross over, well, I think we should do this. Joshua's exactly what you want. I'll do it. Here's the direction. Here's what we'll do. Why that, again, trust could be there. Verse 4, And the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og and the kings of the Amorites in their land when he destroyed them. Those examples of destroying these nations that came out, mighty nations, before they even got to the promised land. Those examples that God would say, I'm going to do the same thing in the promised land. You have to, again, look to God. We think of this importance that's here. So we see is that verse 5, the Lord will give them over to you, and that you may do to them according to every command which I have commanded you. Here comes back to this phrase that we'll see over and over, verse 6, Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Again, another phrase that's often a very quotable verse, but do we believe it? Do we look to God? Here was this instruction, he will not leave you nor forsake you. You, however, can leave God. You can forsake God. But if you follow God, he's always going to be there. We see in verse 7, then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and of good courage. Keeps coming back to the same phrase. Be strong and of good courage, for you must go with this people to the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall cause them to inherit it. God's the one who's going to lead you. You have to follow his lead, and it will take place. Exactly how God gives word. Verse 8, and the Lord, he is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. Why you can be strong and of good courage? Because God is with you. Don't let fear creep in. No, God is there every step of the way. This encouragement that again is here, be strong and of good courage. See, dropping down to verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, the day approaches when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tabernacle of meeting, that I may inaugurate him. Give him that commission. So Moses and Joshua went in and presented themselves in the tabernacle of meeting. This reminder here, which again we skipped over, but verses 9 through 13, goes through the importance of God's law to be read every 7 years, how important it is to keep following God. And here Joshua's appointment when Moses would die. We see dropping down to verse 23, then he inaugurated Joshua the son of Nun and said, be strong and of good courage. Here keeps coming back to that same phrase. It wasn't a catchphrase. It was reminding, don't forget who's really in charge. You keep serving God, and God's there. Be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land of which I swore to them, and I will be with you. Again, God would be with them. That same reminder that's there. This importance as it continues to point to God. We see then in chapter 34, after Moses dies, Deuteronomy 34, we'll hit some of these more in details. We get to them in the Bible studies. Deuteronomy 34. I'm always happy your input. I've thought of doing a midweek Bible study or just doing it on the Sabbath like we've done it in the past before the sermon. But always happy to get input. We'll see if we hopefully get back together and we can do it the way we've always done. Deuteronomy 34, verse 9. Here we see Moses' death on Mount Nebo. Deuteronomy 39, verse 9. And now Joshua the son of Nun was filled of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But since then, again, verses 10 through 12 reminds us, why was there some apprehension? Joshua was not conceited. He did not, obviously I'm the one who should be, I am pretty good. Look at how awesome I am. He started to think about whose shoes he was filling and what the statement about Moses was here. Verse 10, but since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Start to look at what Moses was. He was a wonderful prophet. All these things that God did through him, wasn't Moses who did them. God did it. And why it brings us into chapter 1, verse 1 of Joshua. Verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Still that reminder, he assisted, served Moses. And this still same title that's listed there. And so God telling him here, saying, verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness of this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. Verse 5, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Again, this encouragement God gives to Joshua. I will be there for you. Verse 6, again back to this phrase that occurs over and over, be strong and of good courage. You still have something to do. You got to follow. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to your fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This reminder that keeps coming up, be strong and very courageous, keeps coming back to a condition, to follow God and his laws. Why, I've seen this phrase, although these saying, be strong and of good courage. It's true, but you got to follow God. You cannot be strong and courageous and keep Christmas, keep Easter, keep pagan days that God has nothing to do with. God wants us to follow him, to follow his laws. And you see how much deeper it goes. As you think of through this fast, either today or tomorrow, of what our thought should be on. It says, be strong and very courageous. We see in the verse 8, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. Why you can be strong and courageous? Because you keep looking to God and his ways. We think of this importance, not to depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night. Well, not the leader. Once you become the leader, then you just do things the way you want. No, you keep looking to God's way, and this importance of meditating. It's good to go through in a fast. God, help me to seek your will. Help me to be meditating on your laws, to be digging into it. You shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Again, prosperous and success only comes from following God. Not your own ways, God's ways. This meditation and being strong in God's ways. Putting it in, living it, not turning to the left or the right. Here's what God's word shows. We got to put it into practice. We got to live it. And how God comes back to this same principle, verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Why is God with us wherever we go? Because we're following him. We're following his laws. We don't think, I'll substitute things. I'll add this. I'll subtract this. We meditate on God's laws. They're perfect. What we're to be putting in. We think of this encouragement that's here from verses 1 through 9. And this encouragement that Joshua needed. And it's interesting, it keeps coming back to an attitude with Joshua of humility. It's interesting in verses 10 through 18. You keep looking at Joshua. His humility, he's not, finally, I get to take over for this old guy. I'm the new one in charge. You keep looking at him, point to God. He was leader, but he understood leader meant servant. He was there to serve. And as Moses kept pointing to God, his service now was to keep pointing to God. keep looking to his laws. You look at this humility as now he's been given this responsibility. God continuing telling him, be strong and of good courage, keep following my ways, I'm with you every step of the way. Verse 10, then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, pass through the camp and command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourselves. For within 3 days you will cross over this Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess. And to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, Joshua spoke, saying, remember the word which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is giving you rest, and is giving you this land. Your wives and your little ones and your livestock shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side of the Jordan, but you shall pass before your brethren, armed all your mighty men of valor, and help them, until the Lord has given your brethren rest, as he has given you, and they also have taken possession of the land which the Lord your God is giving them. Then you shall return to the land of your possession and enjoy it, which Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you on this side of the Jordan toward the sunrise. At least twice here we see this mention of Moses, the servant of God, and what Joshua realized, I'm just a servant of God. We see in the verse 16, and they answered Joshua. So here we see Joshua being respected. Why? Because he was a great man, or because he was a man who followed God? We see they answered the people, verse 16, and they answered Joshua in saying, all that you command us we will do, and whatever you send us we will go, or wherever you send us we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words and all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage. The people as well say, keep following God. This encouragement that continue to be there. Be strong and of good courage. Joshua had a good reputation. We see him being humble here. He doesn't point to himself. He points to, here's what God's commands are. Here's what we need to be doing. Giving that command keeps pointing to God. Through so much of this Joshua, the book of Joshua, we see this man and what he lived, where he was. We think of through this whole book of Joshua, Joshua is mentioned by name 168 times. Think we have time to go through every one of these? No. Well, we won't go over time with that. It's a great study, and whether we do it in future sermons, there's so much in here. I'd encourage you to read through Joshua. But you look at him crossing over the Jordan. We looked at that in the last day of unleavened bread in Joshua 3. You look at this command. You look at him, again, following God's exact commands, his exact instructions. And it gets you to Joshua chapter 6, one of the most amazing miracles. You think, again, it wasn't Joshua's might. God could have said, yeah, get all the armor on this, walk around this city once every day. So we think of very likely this was during unleavened bread. And chapter 5 mentions the days of unleavened bread reference. And so you think of walk around, and on the seventh day, walk around it 7 times, and the walls will fall flat. This test to Joshua, all right, do I follow every law of God? I mean, this sounds weird. Humanly speaking, the walls are not going to fall down. We've gone through studies on how thick these walls were. These were not just cardboard walls. They were impenetrable. They would never fall down by man's standards. By God's, you follow these directions, you do exactly what I command, be strong and of good courage. And they fell flat. Joshua listened. He followed God. You think of those encouragement that continues to come in. Turn over to Nehemiah chapter 8. One of the final places we see Joshua mentioned. And I find it interesting, obviously, since we're turning there. Nehemiah chapter 8. We wrap this up. Even this morning I was kept adding things in. I'm thinking, I need to take things out. But there's so much to Joshua and this example of encouragement to us. Nehemiah chapter 8. Well, after Joshua's death, Nehemiah chapter 8, think of, did he follow God? You see through the book of Joshua, you see his example. He kept pointing to God. Think of this section in Nehemiah where the Feast of Tabernacles was being kept, going back to what God's instructions were. And this statement that's made here in chapter 8 and verse 17, so the whole congregation of those who had returned from the captivity made booths, these temporary shelters, temporary dwellings, and sat under the booths. For since the days of Joshua the son of Nun until that day, the children of Israel had not done so, and there was very great gladness. Think of this excitement through all the Feast of Tabernacles into the last great day throughout this section. You think about this statement. None of the other kings, David, Solomon, none of them kept this command that God gave to make temporary booths, these temporary shelters. As they came into the promised land, Joshua keep these temporary dwellings. Don't forget, as we wandered 40 years through the wilderness, it goes back to Joshua continuing to keep it. Think of him continuing to keep God's laws. Quite a statement that's made about Joshua. For since the days of Joshua the son of Nun until that day, the children of Israel had not done so. And then they had great gladness again because they were following God's commands. Joshua was an individual who continued to point to God. As we approach end time events, we have the same reminder in our life. Turn finally over to Hebrews chapter 13. We think of Hebrews 13 and through the entire Bible, this reminder of who do you serve? Who do you serve? The same reminder is to us in end time events. As we get into those times, quickly approaching, we see things going on. We don't know the timeline. We don't know exactly, but we know we're to keep up this attitude of continuing to look to God and remember this important principle. We see in Hebrews chapter 13, this reminder, we'll begin in verse 1, let brotherly love continue. It doesn't just end, well, tough times, give up that. I don't really need to help my brother. Let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, and those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Talking to how we treat each other. It goes back to Matthew 25:26. You start looking at Christ's return, separating the goats from the sheep. The sheep are the ones who continually to serve, to continue to help each other, to continue to look out for each other. So we think of so many of these verses that remind us. Think of how many times I've heard in the past 5-6 weeks on TV, husband and wife, they're having difficulties. Why? If we're living God's standards, we should be able to work it out. Yeah, there's more difficulties. There's difficulties going through these things. But if we're living God's ways and putting them in our lives, meditating on God's words, how do we treat husbands and wives? How do we treat our spouses? How do we treat our children? How will our children treat us? It keeps coming back to God's perfect laws that show us. We think of verse 4, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Verse 5, let your conduct be without covetousness. You think of the past 6 weeks, you look at how much covetousness. You think of the stupid runs on toilet paper. Oh, I've got to have this. Has there been, we have extra. Is there anyone who has needs? Let your conduct be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? This reminder we see continually through Scripture, and as we get closer and closer to end-time events, that we are to make sure our conduct is without covetousness. Yeah, there's things we supply. We make sure things are taken care of, but we're content with what God's given us, what we've gone through. We have to prepare, make sure things are ready, but that we're caring, looking out for each other, realizing through it all, God says he will never leave us or forsake us. The same principle that goes back to Joshua's time is for us. So we learn from Joshua and all that he went through. But again, it comes back to that simple phrase, who are we serving? We're serving the world. We're not looking to God anymore. We are to be servants of God, not servants of fear or anything else. Some of those qualities we've looked at of Joshua, are we developing them? Think of he listened. Are we listening to God's word? He served. We see he served diligently. Are we serving God with our whole heart, mind, and soul? Good things to be thinking about through a fast. To think, are we serving God with our whole heart, mind, and soul? Joshua was dependable. Why was he dependable? Because he kept looking to God's perfect laws. Are we following God's word? Joshua stood up for God, served him. Are we putting God first in our life no matter what? No matter what we're going through? And finally, as we look at those qualities, so many of them, I hate to just list a few here, but we think if he followed God, he pointed to God. Do we continue to follow God no matter what we go through? Do we continue to look him and keep looking back at those examples of God helping us every step of the way in our life? And he will do it the same continually. So we think of, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we think of those principles throughout the Scripture. Sometimes we can get discouraged. You see all those that are not putting their trust in God. Keep coming back to that phrase and thought in my mind. You cannot control others to put their trust in God, but you can put your trust in God. You can't control others. You keep hoping that they'll do it, but you can put your trust in God. Who are we serving? As I mentioned at the beginning, I'll end this quote with Joshua 24, verse 15. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Serve God.